The boots were by the door. Fenn saw them when she came down the stairs that morning. Thomas's boots, the small brown ones she had bought from the dry goods store in Lander last October, lined up neatly on the mat by the kitchen door, the way she had taught him to leave them every night. The boots were by the door, but Thomas was not in the house. His coat was gone from the peg. His wool cap was gone. But the boots were sitting on the mat, toes pointed toward the wall, the laces tucked inside the way a 7-year-old tucks them when he is trying to be tidy and doesn't yet know that the tidiness of the boots is the thing that will terrify his grandmother more than anything else that happens on this day. She checked the bedroom first. His bed was empty, the quilt pulled back. The carved wooden horse lying on the pillow where he always left it. The stove was cold in the kitchen, which meant he had been up before her, which was unusual because Thomas was not an early riser. He was a boy who liked to stay under the quilts until the stove was going, and the kitchen smelled like coffee and corn mush and the particular warmth of a house that has been heated against a Wyoming winter morning. For him to be up and dressed and out of the house before Ada came downstairs meant something had pulled him out. And the only thing that pulled a 7-year-old out of a warm bed on a below-zero morning was the animals. The goat. She had told him the night before that the nanny goat looked poorly. She had said it the way adults say things to children, half to the child and half to herself. A thinking out loud that she didn't expect him to act on. But Thomas was the kind of boy who listened to everything and acted on the things that involved animals, because animals were the part of the homestead that made sense to him in a world where mothers disappeared and fathers rode away, and the only constants were his grandmother and the goat and the chickens and the carved horse on his pillow. She opened the kitchen door, and the cold hit her like a wall. The kind of cold that doesn't just touch your skin, but goes through it, past the muscle, past the bone, into the center of you where the warmth lives, and starts taking it apart. The thermometer on the porch post read 14 below zero. The snow was 3 feet deep across the yard and drifted higher against the barn and the fence line. Yeah, and the path she had shoveled to the barn 2 days ago was already half filled in by the wind that came down off the mountains every night and rearranged everything she had done during the day. She could see his tracks, small tracks in the snow, leading from the kitchen door to the barn, the footprints shallow and close together. The stride of a child walking fast in snow that came up past his shins. But the tracks were not boot prints. They were bare. She could see the shape of his toes in the snow, the narrow impression of a child's bare foot pressed into the white surface and already starting to fill with the fine powder that the wind pushed along the ground like dust. He had gone to the barn barefoot. A sound came out of Ada that she did not recognize. Not a scream and not a word, but something older than both. Is the sound a body makes when the brain has not yet caught up to what the eyes are seeing, but the heart already knows what it means. She went back inside and pulled on her shawl and went out the door and followed his tracks across the yard to the barn. She did not put on her boots. She did not think about her boots. She was 63 years old, and she had raised 5 children and buried a husband and buried 2 of those children, and she was not thinking about boots. She was thinking about a 7-year-old boy walking barefoot through 14 below zero snow because a goat looked poorly and he wanted to help. The barn was empty. The goat was in its stall, alive, chewing straw with the placid indifference of an animal that does not know. It is the reason a boy walked into the cold. Ada checked the stall twice because the barn was dark, and a small boy can fold himself into spaces adults forget exist. Behind the hay bales, under the feed trough, in the corner where the old harness hangs. She called his name, and the word bounced off the timber walls and came back to her with nothing attached. The chickens were on their roost, undisturbed. The horse, Ada's old mare, a swayback buckskin named Ruth that Emmett had bought the year before he died, was standing in the far stall with frost on her whiskers and the slow blink of an animal that has heard a name called and knows it is not her name. Thomas was not there, but his tracks were. They went into the barn through the big door, and then they went out the small door on the north side. The one that faced the open pasture and the fence line and the long white emptiness that stretched a mile north to Cord Harshaw's place. The tracks went out the north door and into the pasture, and Ada followed them, barefoot now herself, her feet in the snow that her grandson's feet had been in minutes or hours before, and the cold was in her, and she did not feel it because the cold in her chest was worse than the cold under her feet. The cold in her chest was the cold of a woman who has already lost too many people and cannot lose one more. She followed the tracks across the pasture. The snow was deep, and her skirts were heavy with it, and her feet were somewhere below her, but she could not feel them anymore, which was a bad sign. She knew that. The way she knew all the signs of a Wyoming winter, because she had lived through 31 of them, and each one had taught her something, and the lesson of the first winter had been that when you stop feeling your feet, the clock starts. But the clock was not hers today. The clock was Thomas's, and his tracks led north through the snow toward the fence line, and beyond it toward the Harshaw place, a mile across open ground where the wind came off the Owl Creek Mountains and turned the air into something that cut. She lost the tracks at the fence line. The wind had swept the ground clean along the wire, piling the snow into drifts on either side and leaving a strip of frozen ground where the prints disappeared. She climbed through the fence, her shawl catching on the wire. Her hands too numb to free it properly, so she pulled and the fabric tore, and she kept going, because fabric is not a grandson, and the choice was not difficult. On the other side of the fence, the snow was deeper, and the drifts were taller, and the tracks were gone. She stood in the white and looked north toward the Harshaw place and could not see it, because the sky and the ground were the same color, and the world had become a single flat sheet of gray-white, nothing in which the only things with dimension were Ada and the fence behind her, and the cold. She called his name. The wind took it the way wind takes everything on the Wyoming flats, without effort, without apology, just a sweep of cold air that peeled the word off her lips and scattered it across the snow where it disappeared into the white, the way his tracks had disappeared. She called again, louder this time, cupping her hands around her mouth the way Emmett used to do when he called the cattle in from the far pasture, and the sound went out and came back empty. She stood at the fence and thought about which direction a 7-year-old boy would go if he was cold and alone, and his grandmother's house was behind him, and the Harshaw place was ahead, and the answer was simple. She walked north because north was where the tracks had been going, and because the Harshaw place was north, and because Thomas knew the Harshaws and had been there with her twice in the last month to trade eggs for flour, and a 7-year-old boy in trouble will go toward the place he knows rather than back the way he came, because children move forward. Children always move forward. It is the one thing about them that is both beautiful and terrifying. She walked for what felt like an hour. It may have been 20 minutes. Cold changes time the way it changes everything else. It stretches some things and compresses others, and the minutes become unreliable. In the same way, the landscape becomes unreliable. When the snow has covered all the markers and the fence posts and the wagon ruts, and there is nothing left to navigate by except memory and stubbornness. Ada had both. She had walked this ground for 31 years. She knew where the creek dipped, and where the sage grew tallest, and where the old cottonwood stood at the halfway point between her place and Cord's, and she walked toward the cottonwood because it was the one thing she could find in the white. She found it, a massive tree, and bare-limbed and dark against the gray sky, its trunk 4 feet across and its roots spread wide under the snow. She put her hand on the bark and leaned against it and tried to breathe, and her breath came out in clouds that the wind snatched away before they could settle. She was shaking, not from cold. She was past the point of shaking from cold, which was another bad sign, the second lesson of the first winter, but from something deeper, from the effort of holding the world together with her body while her body was giving out. She heard the dog before she heard anything else, a bark, sharp and insistent, the bark of a working dog that has found something and wants someone to come and see. Then a voice, deep, male, close. Mrs. Fenn, Ada. Cord Harshaw came out of the white like a man stepping through a curtain. He was on his big bay horse with his sheepskin coat buttoned to his chin and his hat pulled low and his dog running beside him. The dog circling back toward Ada and then forward toward Cord and then back again with the urgent energy of an animal that has been looking for someone and has found them. Thomas, Ada said. The word was all she had left. She couldn't feel her hands or her feet or her face. She could feel her chest, because her chest was where Thomas lived, in the space between her ribs, where grandmothers keep the children they are raising, and that space was the only warm place left in her. He's at my house, Cord said. He was already off the horse and beside her, his big hands on her arms, holding her up because she was swaying and didn't know it. His voice was close and steady, the way you talk to someone who is about to go down, calm and firm and anchored to the ground. Pearl found him at the fence line an hour ago, sitting in the snow with his arms around his knees. He was trying to walk to our place to get help because he thought the goat was dying. He made it most of the way before his legs gave out. Pearl carried him in, and he's warm now. She has him by the stove with a blanket and a cup of broth, and he's been asking for you for the last 30 minutes. He's all right, Ada. The boy's all right. I've been riding out to find you since Pearl told me what direction he'd come from. Ada looked at Cord Harshaw, and the words all right went through her the way warm water goes through a frozen pipe, slowly, with resistance, cracking something open that had been locked shut since she saw the boots by the door. She had been holding herself together for the entire walk, holding herself the way you hold a cracked jar, carefully, with pressure, keeping the pieces in place through sheer will, and now the will let go because the reason for the will was safe. The boy was warm. The boy was at the stove. The boy was asking for her. She sat down in the snow because her legs had decided they were finished, and Cord lifted her onto the horse the way you lift something precious that has become too tired to carry itself. And he walked the horse the last quarter mile to his place, with his hand on the bridle, and the dog running ahead, and Ada on the saddle with her bare feet hanging, and the snow falling on her shoulders like something the sky was trying to give her. Pearl Harshaw met them at the door. She had water boiling and cloths warming by the stove and the particular expression of a woman who has already saved one person today and is prepared to save another. She took Ada inside and sat her in the chair by the stove and wrapped her feet in warm cloths. Not hot, warm. Because hot water on frozen skin does more harm than cold. And Pearl knew this, because every woman in the Wind River Valley knew this the way they knew how to dress an elk and how to read the sky for snow. Thomas was on the floor by the stove, wrapped in a quilt, holding a tin cup of broth with both hands. He looked up at Ada when she came in, and his face did the thing that children's faces do when they see the person they were most afraid of losing. It broke open, all the bravery and the holding together falling away at once. And he was across the room and in her lap before anyone could tell him to be careful of her feet, and he pressed his face against her chest and said, "I went to get help for the goat, Grandma. I didn't mean to get lost, I was only going a little way." Ada held him. She held him with arms that could not feel themselves holding, and hands that were wrapped in warm cloth, and a body that was shaking now, because the warmth was coming back, and the coming back is when the shaking starts. She held him and rocked him and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that her arms were not already saying. The goat was fine. The boy was found. The grandmother had walked a mile through the snow barefoot because the boots were by the door, and her grandson was not. Pearl brought her broth and dry socks and a wool blanket and the kind of quiet competence that is the frontier's version of love. Not spoken, not declared, just performed, one warm cloth at a time. Cord sat at the table and drank his coffee and watched his dog settle by the stove and said nothing because Cord Harshaw was a man who understood that some moments do not need words. They need walls and a stove and a warm room and the sound of a child breathing against his grandmother's chest. They stayed at the Harshaw place for 2 days, Pearl insisted, and Ada did not argue because her feet were the color of old wax, and walking was not something they were going to do for a while. Pearl changed the warm cloths every hour through the first night and fed Ada bone broth and hot tea and the particular stern kindness of a woman who will not let someone she cares about do anything stupid like try to stand up before their feet have remembered what standing is for. Thomas slept on a pallet by the stove both nights, with the Harshaw's old dog curled beside him, the dog having decided on its own that the boy needed guarding, and Ada slept in the chair beside him because she was not willing to be in a different room from him. Not yet. Not until the memory of the empty barn and the bare tracks in the snow had faded enough that she could close her eyes without seeing them. The first night she woke 4 times to check that he was still breathing, leaning down in the dark to feel the warm air against her palm. And each time the breath was there, steady and small, and each time she sat back in the chair and told herself that the next time she would not need to check, but the next time she checked anyway, because that is what grandmothers do. On the 3rd morning, Cord hitched the wagon and drove them home. The snow had settled and compacted overnight, the way Wyoming snow does when the wind finally stops and the cold tightens its grip and packs everything down into a hard white surface that the runners slid over with a hiss. The sky was blue for the first time in a week, a deep, clean blue that only comes after a storm has spent itself, and the Wind River Range stood white and sharp against the western horizon like a row of teeth, every peak and ridge visible in the clear air, and the mountains so close and bright they looked like they had been painted there that morning. Thomas sat between Ada and Cord on the wagon seat with the quilt around his shoulders and the carved wooden horse in his pocket and his boots on his feet, because Ada had sent Cord to the house the day before to bring them, and she had laced them on the boy herself, double-knotted, tight. When they got home, Ada went to the barn first, before she went inside, before she took off her shawl or put the kettle on. She went to the barn and checked the goat. It was fine, standing in its stall, chewing, looking at her with the flat horizontal pupils that goats have, and the expression that could mean anything or nothing. It had been fine the whole time. Whatever Thomas had seen the night before, a limp, a cough, a look in the animal's eye that worried him the way animals always worried him, because he was a boy who paid attention to the things that couldn't speak for themselves, had passed, the way small things pass when they are given time and warmth, and the stubborn refusal of living things to stop living. Ada put her hand on the goat's head and stood there for a moment, and then she closed the stall gate and latched it and went back to the house. She went back to the house and sat in the kitchen and looked at Thomas's boots, which Cord had brought over and set by the door. She picked them up and held them for a moment. These small brown boots that had started everything, that had been sitting on the mat clean and laced while their owner walked into the snow without them. She put them on the shelf above the coats, high enough that a boy would have to ask for them, high enough that a grandmother would hear the asking. She would explain the rule to Thomas later. No going outside without boots, not ever, not even if the barn was on fire and the goat was dancing a waltz. And he would nod and agree and probably remember, because he was a good boy who listened. And if he forgot, she would be awake, and she would hear the door, and she would catch him before the snow did. Then she put the kettle on and made corn mush and called Thomas in from the porch where he was watching the chickens, and the house filled with the sound of a stove working and a boy eating and a grandmother sitting in a chair by the window looking out at the snow that covered the mile between her place and Cord Harshaw's, the mile that had almost been too far and had turned out to be just far enough for two people who loved each other to prove that love is not a feeling. It is a direction. It is the direction you walk when you cannot feel your feet, and the only thing that keeps you moving is the knowledge that somewhere ahead, in the white, in the cold, there is someone small who needs you to arrive.